All right, hopefully, this is the fifth and final take. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory, and I'm going to go over a little bit of history, and it's going to involve mining and violence, so stay tuned for that. And there's even a little bit of a local connection that I'll get into. So, on April 29th, 1899, in northern Idaho, a train packed with armed miners barrels through the mountains toward one of the richest mines in America. These men are angry, organized, and done negotiating. By the end of the day, the Bunker Hill and Sullivan Mine in Wardner, Idaho, will be reduced to twisted steel and splintered timber by thousands of pounds of dynamite. The blast is heard for miles, and the American labor wars are entering a new phase. This is the story of the Western Federation of Miners, a union born in the violent mining camps of the American West, a movement shaped by private armies, martial law, prison camps, assassinations, and occasional massacres. And like I suggested, a few of which are oddly relevant to my area and even my family history. So that's hopefully going to make you a little bit more interested in it because, I'm somebody who's, you know, a little bit relevant to this. My family was in some ways involved in this history that I'm in some of the history that I'm going over. Certainly not all of it, but some of it. And it's also the story of how American workers began to lose faith that the legal system would ever protect them. And does that sound relevant today at all? Possibly, possibly. So let's get into the explosion at Wardner. At the end of the 19th century, the Coeur d'Alene mining district in Idaho was one of the most profitable mining regions in the country. Silver poured out of the mountains, and wealth poured into the pockets of mine owners. But miners lived a different reality. They had long hours, dangerous tunnels, frequent injuries, most certainly occasionally deaths, and of course, meager pay. And increasingly, they were organizing to maybe do something about that. And the Western Federation of Miners, or WFM, had become one of the most militant labor unions in the United States. Mine owners saw the union as a direct threat to their profits and control, so they fought back. Union workers were fired, blacklists had spread across the region, and companies refused to recognize the union. Then came Wardner. On April 29th, roughly 1,000 Union miners commandeered a train and rode toward the Bunker Hill and Sullivan mine. When they arrived, they evacuated about 300 workers from the site, and then they planted dynamite throughout the mill. The explosion destroyed the facility, and witnesses described smoke and debris erupting into the sky while the shockwave rolled across the valley. And production at one of the richest mines in the West stopped instantly. And for the miners, it was retaliation, but for the mine owners and for the government, it was insurrection. And Idaho Governor Frank Steunenberg responded immediately. Martial law was declared, federal troops moved into the mining district, and more than 1,000 miners were arrested. Many were held without formal charges in makeshift detention camps, and union leaders became special targets. The message was clear: organized labor would be treated as a military threat. Then the Wardner explosion, it had a ripple effect. It didn't end the labor wars; it escalated them. A few years later, the conflict spread into Colorado during the labor wars of 1903 and 1904. Again, the Western Federation of Miners faced mine owners determined to crush union organizing. Again, state governments sided with business interests. To nobody's surprise, Colorado Governor James Peabody declared martial law in multiple counties, and the National Guard entered mining communities with sweeping powers. Workers were detained without trial, some were locked inside crude detention centers known as bullpens, and others were deported from towns entirely. Business leaders formed anti union groups called citizens' alliances, and these organizations coordinated strike breaking efforts and often worked hand in hand with the local authorities. Violence became routine, and almost nobody on the side of management faced consequences. No mine owners were convicted for any attacks on workers. No militia officers were meaningfully punished, and to many miners, the courts looked less like neutral institutions and more like weapons used against labor. And that realization changed the Union forever. And then emerged people like Big Bill Haywood and the turn toward radicalism. So two men emerged from these battles deeply transformed. There was Charles Moyer and William Big Bill Haywood. And of course, there were others, but I'm just talking about them because they were prominent in this movement. They had watched strikes fail, they had watched troops occupy mining towns, they had watched workers jailed without charges while corporations operated freely, and they came to a conclusion. Traditional craft unionism was not enough. The problem, they believed, wasn't just one company or one governor, it was the entire industrial system. So in 1905, Haywood and other labor radicals helped found a new organization, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, sometimes called the Wobblies. Unlike older unions that organized workers by trade, the IWW wanted one massive industrial union capable of shutting down entire industries. Their vision was openly revolutionary, and to critics, including eventually Charles Moyer himself, who some would say went soft or whatever, but according to the critics, the IWW was considered too dangerous. And then came an event that nearly destroyed the movement altogether, the assassination of Frank Steunenberg. So in 1905, the former Idaho Governor Frank Steunenberg, who I had mentioned earlier, was assassinated outside his home by a bomb attached to his gate. So the killing shocked the nation. Authorities quickly targeted leaders of the Western Federation of Miners, Charles Moyer, Big Bill Haywood, and George Pettibone. Sorry about messing up that last name. For some reason, I put an H there. But anyway, the arrests themselves became infamous. Union leaders were effectively kidnapped and extradited across state lines under questionable legal circumstances at best. And the trial that followed became one of the most important labor cases in American history. Defending the Union leaders was Clarence Darrow. The famous attorney argued that prosecutors were using the assassination to destroy organized labor itself. After a dramatic trial, Haywood was acquitted. The prosecution's case collapsed under scrutiny. And despite the success, labor unions and labor activists still believed that the state power was being weaponized against unions. So the temporary wins here and there were not enough to sway them into just being pacified, and it reinforced fears that labor radicalism was spiraling into violence across the country. Either way, the divide in America was deepening. Now, here's where I get a little bit into some local history because I'm talking about Michigan in 1913. So by 1913, the Western Federation of Miners had suffered major defeats in the Rockies. But another major struggle was unfolding far to the east, Michigan's copper country, where I happen to live. So tens of thousands of miners went on strike across the Keweenaw Peninsula, demanding safer conditions, union recognition, and a living wage. The strike quickly became bitter. Mining companies hired strikebreakers, the Citizens Alliance mobilized against the Union, and violence escalated. Then on December 7th came the Jane Dally murders, and that was something that's a little bit relevant to me. Before dawn, gunmen fired roughly 16 rifle shots through the walls of a boarding house in Painesdale, Michigan. Three men were killed while they slept: Thomas Daly, Arthur Jane, and Harry Jane. The victims were miners who had crossed picket lines to return to work, and the attack was widely understood as a warning to strikebreakers, and public outrage exploded. And Charles Moyer, as head of the WFM, became the face of a union increasingly associated with violence. Interestingly, I have to note this. My great aunt Corrine actually lived in the Jane Dally murder house, and my grandma lived right next door. So, you know, that's one of the ways in which the story is relevant to me. My great aunt Corrine actually lived in that murder house. So, when you read up on something that's a little bit more relevant to you in that way, well, it's kind of interesting. Plus, I had, a relative who died in a mining accident back in the day. It was like, I don't know if it was a great uncle or like a great grandfather, but it was something like that. And I even got a chance to look at his pay stubs and stuff like that, his records. So I had an opportunity to sort of get more immersed in that history and see that, oh, this person actually did exist. I'm looking at their financial records in the mining records, in the museum of that place. So a better known tragedy than that unfolded, and it was only weeks away: the Italian Hall disaster. Now, this is one that more people have definitely heard of. In On Christmas Eve, 1913, in Calumet, Michigan, hundreds of striking miners and their families gathered for a Christmas party at Italian Hall. Many of the children had received gifts. There was music, food, celebration. It sounds like it had some good vibes going on. Then someone apparently shouted one word: fire. There was no fire, though, but panic swept through the crowded second floor. Families rushed toward the stairwell, people fell, bodies piled against each other near the bottom of the stairs, and by the end of the night, 73 people were dead. So think about that. That's quite a lot of people. And 59 of them were children. And to this day, no one knows with certainty who shouted the false alarm. Multiple witnesses claim the man wore a Citizens Alliance pin, but no one was officially identified, no one was convicted, and the disaster devastated the strike. And it led directly to another act of violence. Days later, members of the Citizens Alliance kidnapped Charles Moyer from the Scott Hotel in Hancock, Michigan, where I currently live. And coincidentally, I live, not only near this building, but uh, I frequent the Mexican restaurant that is now in that building. And also, my uncle Wayne used to live in one of the apartments upstairs. It was no longer really relevant to the mining history, other than the fact that Charles Moyer was kidnapped there. As they kidnapped Charles Moyer, they beat him and shot him in the shoulder. I guess they might have shot him up like a bunch of different times. I don't know the exact bullet count, but he survived. They forced him onto a train and ordered him to leave the district forever. Moyer did survive, though, like I said, and when he reached Chicago, he publicly displayed his injuries and vowed to continue the struggle. But all of these incidents, they kind of create a bad vibe. So it's one of those things that kind of permanently turns some people away from unions. And that's a little bit ironic because when governments themselves or corporations themselves contribute to violence, a lot of people don't, instantly say, uh, no more government, no more corporations, no more business. So it's a little bit one sided, and that's a little bit due to the propaganda campaigns that are involved in propping up, businesses and governments and so forth. Like I've said before, you hear about bomb throwing anarchists, but you don't hear about bomb dropping governments, do you? So a lot of it has to do with how these things are framed and the fear mongering that goes into these things. Because you know what? Let me put it this way: if these workers were leading satisfied lives and things were going reasonably well, it seems like they would have fewer things to complain about. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, some people are always going to have problems here and there, but if life was reasonably comfortable and the system seemed to be taking care of people, it seems like there would be less violence or less of a risk of violence happening. So a lot of this has to do with memory, myth, and legacy, too, how we view these events. The Italian Hall disaster entered American labor memory as both a tragedy and a symbol. Many people still believe the victims died because the doors opened inward, trapping the crowd inside, and that story was immortalized in Woody Guthrie's song titled 1913 Massacre. That's right, Woody Guthrie, the famous folk musician who actually was the key influence on Bob Dylan. But anyway, he wrote about the Italian Hall disaster and presumably other such events related to the labor movement. But it's another interesting cultural aspect of this, and historians now generally agree that actually the doors opened outward, not inward. So technically, unfortunately, that song is apparently not accurate in terms of the doors, how the doors functioned. So that's a little bit of trivia for you in terms of lyric uh, history. And the real cause was the crushing pressure of the stampede in the narrow stairwell. And even so, the danger was there, obviously, and the deeper truth remains unchanged. Workers and their families died in an atmosphere that was poisoned by fear, violence, and class warfare. And now the Italian Hall disaster is often cited as the possible inspiration for that rule regarding free speech of not being able to shout out the word fire in a crowded theater. You often hear about that as being where free speech ends. And this is still, it's considered a mystery of who was to blame. And the labor conflicts of the early 20th century forced Americans to confront difficult questions. What happens when workers believe the legal system belongs entirely to corporations? What happens when governors deploy troops against citizens who are demanding better wages? What happens when labor movements conclude peaceful negotiation can no longer work? So these weren't abstract debates. They were battles fought with rifles, dynamite, prison camps, and bloodshed. And the Western Federation of Miners never fully recovered from these wars. But its legacy lived on through the industrial workers of the world and later labor movements that continued pushing for things like safer workplaces, shorter hours, and union rights. And today, many of the places where these conflicts unfolded are quiet. Wardner, Cripple Creek, Calumet. I mean, here's the thing about Calumet, Michigan. That's about like 12, maybe 13 miles away from me, something like that. But at one point, that was actually going to be possibly the state capital. So, yeah, a lot of people left after the mining kind of died down in this area. Well, I guess it didn't just die down, it kind of vanished in a lot of places. There is still some mining that happens around here, but it's definitely a shadow of its former self. And beneath that quiet, the history still lingers, of course. People still talk about this stuff. And it's a reminder that the struggle over who holds power in America has often been fought not only in courtrooms and in elections, but in mines, on picket lines, and in the streets. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Maybe you learned a thing or two. I know I probably rambled a little bit here and there. I messed up words. Hopefully, I didn't mumble too much, but I'd like to thank you for listening to the episode. And if you enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone interested in labor history, American radicalism, or the hidden stories behind industrial America. So until next time, uh, have a nice day, I guess. That's a generic thing you can say to end a podcast episode. So there it is. Have a good one.